I think, people are feeling incredibly daunted as they do like every summer now, where, increasingly summer is like the season of climate disaster where we have to confront all kinds of increasingly like just glaring impacts of this massive experiment that humanity has been running for more than 100 years to see how much our planet can actually take. And we're meeting in Mi'kma'ki. We're meeting to talk about climate politics in so-called Canada. And I think it might make sense to kind of like situate ourselves. We did a kind of formal, and it is a kind of a formalized thing, but an important thing. Last time with Nina, where we, did a proper land acknowledgement to, point to the fact that like this is unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. The generations and generations and generations, the millennia old caretaking that Indigenous nations have done across so-called Canada is an unsung part in some ways of the climate struggle, and we'll be talking about that really more specifically in relationship to Sadie Beaton's activism and research at the end of the month. But it still, I think, makes sense to situate ourselves in relationship to that legacy, and to, in some ways, try to honor that legacy going forward, which is just not what we see in spaces of official politics in Canada. I mean, the example I wanted to start with is the inception and then untimely, very fast demise of Canada's anti-greenwashing legislation. So, I mean, like under Trudeau, under Justin Trudeau's liberal leadership, Canada introduced this legislation that made it more difficult for companies to claim that they were doing environmental work. And it was effective. You saw all kinds of bullshit claims disappear from the internet, basically. And then Mark Carney basically immediately reverses that decision and makes it a lot more easy to greenwash oil sands operations and the like, right? And we've seen as a result like copious examples of ads for fossil fuels that make them seem like an inevitable part of our lives. And I thought, just as like a tangible thing that we can point to and say, like, did you see this on like the bus shelter? We could start with these idiotic disinformation ads by like natural gas companies, for example, that are meant to reassure users that this is reliable power, that this is in fact also even like green energy. You know, there's even messaging that explicitly blames clean energy for spiking electricity prices and so on. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts to start on how we can maybe counter in this critical moment the kind of marketing we're seeing from oil and gas companies, which has been given like carte blanche basically to greenwash and I think lie to people in Canada. And maybe Chris, you could
Yeah,
jump in here. Yeah,
I can start on that one, sure.
thanks.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. The gas industry has been really good at this for a long time, and they've really done a good job of positioning themselves as green and clean. Um, and it seems clean. I mean, when you compare oil, say in a home, heating your home with oil to gas, it's less smelly. It's a clean system and it hides the pollution very well. Um, but in fact, the the methane, burning and producing methane, it's a far more potent greenhouse gas in terms of changing the climate and wreaking havoc on the climate than carbon. Um, by like 80-fold. It's an incredibly powerful climate changer. But they made this claim so long ago, it really embedded. And I know people who are very have an environmental ethic who have switched to gas because of that claim, which is false. Um, and it's better known that that is false now. But of course, they're still doing a very good job of making that claim, and they're countering the counter. But there has been a counter, and it has been effective in educating people. So the difference is in the depth of the pockets. The people like me who want to make claims about what is and isn't clean energy, who work for nonprofits, have no budget. Um, and I've often talked about, we need a social marketing campaign showing what a good energy system would look like. And of course, we just don't have the money to do it like an oil and gas operation. But there's guerrilla marketing. There's you can take what exists in the system, and we all have there was the old, I forget who said the quote, but the only way to have a free press is to own one. With social media, we all kind of own one. It's a little one. Our platform is only so big. And even if you're a whiz on social media, you might have tens of thousands of followers, but that's nothing compared to what, a few minutes on mass market television in terms of eyes on your message gets you. So, but you can use the modern technology and social marketing, and we at EAC have done that. We have done digital media buys to show a different kind of energy system, free of gas, beyond oil, beyond coal, and what that could look like and what that would involve. And we talk about things like offshore wind and onshore wind. And we talk about the energy mixes, and we talk about the best bang for your buck is energy efficiency, good old energy efficiency, which also employs way more people than oil and gas. So there is a message, and we are now creating a series of fact sheets, the good old fashioned fact sheet, plain and boring, but short and to the point, and just showing our vision of what an energy system could and should be in this province. And what a clean energy system looks like, what an efficient energy system looks like, what an affordable energy system looks like. And your question didn't even quite get into the justice of it, but gas is really expensive. It's a privileged thing, and we have a really high rate of energy poverty in this province. And the only real long-term solution is to have efficient buildings and efficient homes. Renters really have trouble, especially accessing efficiency programs and affording things like heat pumps and beefing up their insulation and things like that. So we're advocating for things like that, and we're using the fact sheets as a starting point. It helps us to put down on paper what we want to see, because it helps us clarify our thoughts and say it in a way that people can understand. And that is clear. And that's the other thing, is all this stuff gets obscured by very technical jargon and information. And at the regulatory level, you get lawyers arguing with lawyers about what economists say. And it's very technical and very hard to access and understand. So we're trying to take these complex things, understand them as well as we can. We aren't always technicians ourselves, and express them in ways that the public can understand. And that's a really good starting point. And then from that, we'll build kind of good social media. And we've even hired an influencer who did a bang up job just doing really fun videos that got tons of eyes on them via TikTok and Instagram. So it's using those modern methods and being a bit of a guerrilla marketers. There was way back in the 50s, this guy, H.L. Mencken, I think his name was. I studied him in my grad school, but he said a famous phrase: "Why can't you sell brotherhood like you sell soap?" And that phrase kind of was the founding point of social marketing. And social marketing can take many forms. It's basically just selling an idea, though. It's propaganda. And we're in a propaganda war. So we have to act like it. We have to have a good message, a good frame, and be able to sell our message and our ideas. And you can do that through slick media, but you can also do it through community and at events, and talking to people and in conversation. Like, it doesn't have to be this inhumane thing. It doesn't have to be this slick commercial, and it doesn't have to be gross.
I think it's also important, Chris. I'm agreeing with everything you say here, just nodding my head, but I think it's also important to dig into what is the emotional promise that the gas industry's advertisements are making. What are they really getting at? They're not really selling natural gas. They're selling things like safety, reliability, freedom from disruption and anxiety. And that's what people are looking for. It's an age of uncertainty. So as we try to explain technologies in plain language, super important, but it's also super important to figure out, how do we align our messaging with those deep-seated emotional needs that people are quite rightly experiencing right now? The fear of energy poverty, the fear of outages, affordability, all of that stuff. So I think part of what I'm really enjoying seeing EAC do is not just explain the facts and figures around energy, green energy, but helping people to see why it actually is going to contribute to a safer, more reliable, disruption-free, potentially more economical for the individual consumer future. It's getting into that part of the matter for folks.
Yeah, I think that those are such incredibly important points. And I was doing like a little bit of just like rote cybersecurity training for my job today, and they were talking about like how phishing scams are a form of like propaganda in the sense that they are working on the level of social engineering. Like they're trying to sort of deceive you on the basis of kind of your raw emotions around the need for like validation or maybe your anxieties and your fears. Like unfortunately we are incredibly just like swarmed, saturated, bombarded by messages, and we have virtually no choice but to kind of enter into this kind of like what Gramsci would call like a war of position. And Chris, your point is well taken that like these platforms are an important terrain where that is being played out, and yet we don't own them. It's not like it's a actual free press. We are in this kind of amorphous place where the algorithm is largely determining this, and we just have to try and adopt the best possible strategies, I think, to create messaging that does register on that emotional level, as Kate's saying, and also meets the folks that are curious about the technology where they're at, where they're we're coming up with a less technical way of communicating the value of it. There's two ways we can maybe take that too, right? Like one is how do we spark the public's curiosity and like imagination around clean energy? But the other, and I think maybe more kind of like pressing in some ways, question is how do we, communicate with people in a way that doesn't have them turn away or tune out when it comes to the need for climate adaptation. And I think maybe we'll talk about that if it's okay. First, I was reading this unbelievable article in Vox today by Brian Walsh, which argues that, and I'll quote it just quickly: the dangerous effects we've been warned about are here, locked in on every time scale that matters to the people living through them. We can't prevent the worst from happening right now, so we need to figure out how we're going to adapt to it. The article is titled something like "Climate Adaptation Isn't Surrender; It's Survival," and I think like that's a hurdle itself. Like that headline is addressing a hurdle, the hurdle of allowing it first of all to be true, as Nina Newington put it in my interview with her, that we've reached this kind of breaking point where a lot of these things are locked in. I guess I'll ask Kate what you've learned with working with the AC, but even before that on food and with libraries and so on, about how to maintain morale in that
Right.
context. Like, how do you keep people's courage and capacity when it does feel like these impacts are just coming faster and more intensely with every year,
Right. I think what I'm noticing most of all is that now is really a time where, I think for a while we were really focused on not driving people to despair and instead giving them hope. I think where we are now is moving into a stage of saying, we don't give up hope, but we have to now be courageous. We now have to step into bravery. And I actually think that that is a really important moment. You know, when you think about a huge cohort of young people, young men especially, who are being sold a very particular kind of masculinity and bravery and courage via the manosphere, right? That's a huge untapped potential of young men who are looking for purpose, who are looking to use their energy, enthusiasm, um, strength, bravery, desire to protect, all of those traits. And I really feel like the time is right to be calling all of those gifts, not just with young men, but calling all of our gifts to the forefront. The message that's been resonating as my colleagues and I do climate action outreach here in the HRM is really saying to people, um, we need to drop the shame around climate action. Not any one of us can fix this. This is going to go on longer than our generation, longer than our next generation, the next and the next. We're locked in for all sorts of terrible things. But what we have is ourselves and each other and community right now. Every degree of warming that we prevent really matters. And this is a really beautiful time to say to folks, every skill, gift, and talent matters. If you sing, if you paint, if you're a scientist, if you can do math, if you can bake cookies, all of it can be brought to the table in the service of community building. When we break past that isolationist mindset many of us have been raised in, and start focusing on how do we help people build the relational and emotional safety they need in order to feel brave, that's where we get the traction, right? It's calling people back into this idea that, yeah, people, we annoy each other. But at the end of the day, we're stronger together. We have to break through the polarization of us, them, left, right, whatever, and find ways to bring our communal sets of gifts to the table and work together in collaboration. And I think what I'm seeing is that our courage grows through participation. People feel a whole lot less helpless when adaptation is something that they can shape in their own communities rather than having someone above them in government or an expert telling them what to do. You know, communities know what they need often, and they have a huge array of gifts. And I think where the courage comes is really creating that invitation. Everyone belongs, everyone needs to be in this. Every contribution is valuable. It's not about the best contribution or the biggest or the shiniest. We can all do something and we need to value it. The beautiful piece of that message is not, and we can beat climate change. Like, I have to be really clear about that. We have to be courageous and accept that most of us will be long gone by the time this ship gets turned around. And there's actually no guarantee that the ship will get turned around, right? But
Yeah.
we have our one and only lives, and we have the opportunity to live those one and only lives with joy, with community, with love, with purpose, with ingenuity, creativity. Or we can choose the other path, which is to live our one and only lives in despair. You know, I know which choice I would make. So that's what we spend our time telling people.
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful poetic kind of a pitch for kind of, alleviating some of this like rabid competitive individualism that seems to be normalized under like neoliberal capitalism and stuff, right? And it's funny that you mentioned the manosphere. I did ultimately end up subjecting myself to Louis Theroux's Manosphere documentary on Netflix. And that was the overriding like theme, was really the I me mine quality of the manosphere. The fact that on the whole there's a kind of predatory competitive individualism that justifies any and all, even hypocritical, amoral kinds of actions, in the for the purpose of self-interest, like perpetrating and perpetuating one's own self-interest. So I mean, I think that point is really well taken, and it's funny we're recording this on a day where like maybe the world's most famous manosphere influencer has actually been arrested, Andrew Tate, and there are now conversations about what it means for this shift to take place, where you're no longer valorizing that kind of like misogynistic idea of like all forms of dependency are weakness, all forms of entanglement and responsibility are pathological. So yeah, I mean, your point is super well taken. That yes, climate change is a wicked problem. We're not going to defeat it, but we still need to like fight tooth and nail together to mitigate its effects,
And I
because
think
it's
the
not
the
solvable alone.
definition of bravery, particularly for young men, and I've known some young men who've sort of gotten sucked into that manosphere
Mm,
messaging. What was interesting was it was less about the misogyny and more about wanting to have purpose.
mm,
And I think if we can shift that narrative so that young men are hearing that courage is not domination, toughness, never
mm-hmm,
admitting fear, the lone wolf mentality, but that courage is being willing to stand in the face of what is,
mm-hmm,
to face reality, to face all of the tough emotions that come with it, and to stand with others and to stand for others who can't protect themselves,
mm-hmm,
and to do that work of repair. I mean, that's a really powerful role that I would love to see the young men I know stepping forward to play. We need
mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah,
And it's a beautiful message. Like I think
it
I,
is.
I think we're going to see a shift away from the shiny prepackaged bullshit of
Mm-hmm,
our podcast, Andrew Tate and his ilk, towards a more mature understanding of what bravery, courage, leadership really means. And it has a lot to do with emotional literacy and integrity. Um,
mm-hmm.
yeah.
And I think, like, in a way, openness to change, transition, transformation, like the idea that trying to secure patriarchal privilege and invest in a kind of petro nostalgia or petro masculinity for this point in the past where things were better and somehow more stable, and like just there was going to be growth forever. um, like that has to be fracturing a little bit. And I wonder, Chris, if we can maybe link this to like the question of a just transition, right? Like, how do you take folks that say like I work in natural gas. I work. That's like my job
Mm.
is based in fossil fuel extraction,
Mm.
and convince those folks that it is, you know, courageous in some ways to accept that nature has these limits. We cannot continue burning the unbelievable amount, 100 million barrels a day of oil that we burn. And you can reskill. There is work in the clean energy transition. Millions of jobs
Mhm.
to be found in the clean energy transition. In the research you've looked at and the work that you've done, do you find that that is a message that resonates with folks? That promise of a just transition, work in the clean energy industry, or do you find that you need to kind of like modulate the message in certain ways, depending on your audience?
Um, I find it is a very tough sell to someone who makes their living a certain way that
Mm,
their their living is a problem.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
it's just a survival means, I think, that people will be defensive if they feel that they're put in a position where their livelihood
Hmm.
jeopardized. And I think in all our transition work, that's why we talk about a just transition. The federal bill, there was a federal bill that was the Just and Sustainable Jobs Act, and they dropped just from it, and Justin dropped the just from it, and it became the Sustainable Jobs Act, unfortunately. And I think it's important to consider justice, not only for the sake of the workers who do lose out. I mean, that's when you change from one tech to another tech, which is what we're proposing, or one tech to many other techs. The people in the old tech lose out. That is a fact, and they have to, if they're forced to transition, that is difficult. And we saw it with the coal mines in Cape Breton, classic example. And before that, it was steel. And it's like so many industry. And unfortunately, our province staked itself to the promises of big industry, which come and go. And that's the thing. We cannot allow, and this is part of the just tradition, we cannot allow ourselves to just put all our horses and tether them to offshore wind or whatever, any one thing. I mean, what we need is a diverse economy that works for human beings. And I think when you look at things like oil and gas, these are massive, polluting, dirty industries. They hurt the humans who work in them more than anyone else. Financially, they can be very lucrative, but in terms of your body and soul, it's extremely destructive. And I have family who have worked in there and who have given their bodies. I have friends who have hurt their bodies in the tar sands out west, and lost their livelihood for that. These are not secure livings anyway. They're dangerous work often. But it is a tough sell for sure, for me to say, like, and I don't think I would ever purport to say you should leave that industry and go to wind. But what I can do is try to make the case that wind is exciting. It's new, it's different, it's cleaner. It's not without an impact. Every source of energy has environmental impact, but it's far less impact than oil and gas. And it can be more community based. At one point, we had a really good program with a boring name, feed-in tariffs, in this province, where communities bought or used their land to install wind turbines, and they got financial benefit from that. And they continue to do that today. Unfortunately, the program is no more. It lived and died with the NDP government that we had, or the Liberal government that followed it, I think, killed it. So, yeah, in terms of back to your question, yeah, I don't think I would make the case that you're in a dead industry and you need to get out. I think I would just talk about the alternative and the beauty of the alternative, and that it is a transition. But it is not all the answers are in wind. Where there's a lot of there's exciting new technologies emerging all the time. I'm getting into the idea of balcony solar, which is huge in Pakistan, and has actually moved them to a much cleaner energy system where they get more from solar than any other source now. And it's mostly just balcony plug-in little solar panels that renters can use. And again, this solves the issue that renters always face, where they're paying the utility bills, but they don't have any control over the unit because they don't own it, and they're not allowed to install a heat pump even if they have the money, which often they don't. And so a plug-in solar, much cheaper alternative. Not so big in Canada, but the potential is there. So we've seen it elsewhere. So there's always changing technologies. And I think what I would, the sell that I make is that there are lots of alternatives and there are lots of opportunities. And there's a way to do an economy that serves people. But to do that, you really have to keep that in mind. The goal is to serve people. The goal is not the technology itself. And that's where we lose our way when we get into things like nuclear, which is sold often as a solution because it's clean. But it's actually, the people running nuclear are billionaires. They're not clean people. So, it's like they're often boondoggles. They far exceed their estimated costs. And so solar and wind, they're smaller in scale. They're more people focused. And that's what's kind of exciting about them. But, in 10 years, I might be talking about another technology that's even more efficient and better. Right now, heat pumps are all the rage. There's nothing saying that they'll still be the thing in 20 years. Technology changes very rapidly with increasing rapidity over time. So who knows what will take us, but it's important to keep in the bigger goals of sustainability Um, and yeah, the transition is a complicated and ever shifting thing, but it is happening. And I think what's important in terms of people who are in the oil and gas is to remember, hey, it doesn't employ as many people as the proponents claim it does.
Mm-hmm.
In Nova Scotia, I think it's about a couple thousand people. There's far more people employed in energy efficiency at this stage than in that. There's far more people in clean energy than in that. It's and the potential is huge. We estimated that we could be creating 15,000 jobs a year just by meeting our current greenhouse gas reduction goals through the clean energy and energy efficiency and all the building retrofits that need to be done. Um, so it's my case is not that, oh, you're in a bad industry, get out. What I'm saying is that industry is dwindling. It is happening. And the growth of the other industries is exciting in terms of its potential. Um, so when we talk to people getting out of it, it's not, probably not going to be by choice, and we should really think about what are their options going forward, and how can we make sure they're okay
Mhm.
because they're part of our community as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Yeah,
One
I think
piece of
that's
data
great.
that just came out from Reclimate was kind of interesting related to all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And it looked at a number of studies and research. I'm trying to say, not just one study across Canada, looking at how people's attitudes towards green energy. And what was fascinating to me was that the largest majority of Canadians said that they would feel really proud if we were running the country primarily on green energy.
Mm-hmm.
But about the same number of people also said, but we can't do it right now. And I think that's a really interesting space that we need to look at because we know that we actually can do an awful lot of that right now. So there's this gap that I think the EC has been working really hard to try to fill with fact sheets and information. But there is this perception gap. You know, people want green energy in our country. So I think my question is, what do we have to do to illustrate the benefits, illustrate the possibilities in a way that captures people's imagination?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100% agree. And that study I found remarkable. Like that is true across the board, including in Alberta, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where which is the heart of oil production in Canada, where there is this deep seated political sense that the very identity of the province is attached to oil and gas. Even there, the majority of people say that they would be more proud of Canada being a clean energy superpower. And so it's a question of, how do you kind of detoxify the exit from this system and strand these assets without abandoning workers, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, it feels like storytelling is potentially very helpful here because of what you're describing, which is this like loggerheads moment of people like feeling with conviction that we need to change, that we would benefit a great deal from changing, and that at the same time we cannot. Right. So what like the problem for me is like where does that feeling of political realism come from? That pragmatism? How do crises kind of feed into that sense that even what we need to do and can do is somehow unimaginable, right? Because of like economics. Yeah, it seems to have a lot to do with precarity, right? And when I think about precarity, when I think about the really big strains on society and the fears that people have around climate, honestly, my mind very often goes to food and food insecurity. This is a thing that since COVID has been on people's radar. The fact of inflationary pressures has made it more and more of an everyday topic. Like people just express with incredulity that food costs as much as it does now. There are many, many threats to the food system, and it feels as though we're on the precipice of like actual food system collapse with like drought and biodiversity loss and all of these different kind of, tipping points. I struggle to not feel real dread in relationship to this particular problem, which there are technological solutions, there are social answers, but I guess I wanted to ask you, because you have experience in this, Kate, like when you see reports about how severely climate change is already impacting global food systems, do you let in that feeling of like it's over? Like we are at a point of actual collapse? Or, given the people you work with and all of these like really inspiring local food systems innovators, are you more inclined to kind of lean into that feeling of a certain measured hope around what human responses we can have to the food side of the climate crisis?
I think the truthful answer is that I give time to both. I
Yeah.
think you're not a human doing this work and facing the reality of the time that we're in without occasionally feeling the fear wash over you. So, and I think it's actually important to allow that, not to live in it, not to let it paralyze you, but to make friends with the feeling of um, fear and confusion, analyze it, let it sit in your body, and then kind of move it aside so you can get other things done. So that's one. I think the piece that gives me some perspective on it is that we can look at climate change and we can look at food systems globally, which is pretty freaking overwhelming, or we can look at it on a more local level. And that's where I feel a whole lot more hope. Um, the food system is frighteningly vulnerable, but it's also full of points of intervention. And it's actually one of the easiest places to make change at a very local level. If you look at Nova Scotia's history, we were at one time quite food secure. We did produce the vast majority of our food here at home. The number of farms that we used to have in this province has diminished incredibly over decades and decades. But we still have the land base, we still have the land knowledge. I don't think it's realistic to expect that we can completely relocalize our food here in Nova Scotia. Nor do I think it's realistic to expect that some brilliant food innovators are going to just invent something that will fix it all for us. I think it's going to be a lot of different interventions. Locally, I think what is really positive is that you see municipalities, certainly our municipality here in the HRM, increasingly stepping forward and saying it's not technically within our mandate, but we see the value if we're trying to drive towards climate adaptation. Food has to be part of that, right? I think councillors and others are beginning to see more and more and more that if you support a climate action plan, you also have to support a food action plan. So here in HRM, we're lucky to have the Just Food Action Plan, which was created by scores and scores of community organizations and collaborators over about a decade. It's been endorsed by the municipality. It's looking at the health of the land. It's looking at how we farm, how we produce food, how we get it from here to there, how we waste less of it. This food waste is actually a big contributor to the whole climate picture. It's addressing affordability. It's addressing labor standards for agricultural workers. It's addressing equity and food sovereignty for Mi'kmaq and Black Indigenous, or Mi'kmaq and Black Nova Scotia communities. So it's doing a lot, and there are an awful lot of people involved in trying to make things better here at home. I think for those who might be listening who are wondering, where is one of the best bangs for my buck in terms of getting involved in climate volunteering and climate action? Food is actually a great place to be. Mm-hmm. For one thing, when you work with others around food, you instantly create community. So community gardening is partly about food and partly about eating, and it's partly about bringing neighbors and communities together and helping them see each other. when you're gathered around a community garden, you're trading ideas, you're trading perspectives, you're trading other skills that go towards the sustainability of our communities. So, yeah, in that sense, food systems work actually gives me a lot of hope in all of this. And I think it is best in this case to try to look at more local interventions. Globally, I have to trust that communities around the world are doing similar sorts of things, relocalizing what they can, working in networks, trying to make changes in regions rather than worldwide.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Can I
And
make a quick
please, yeah.
comment on it? It's I find I'm fascinated by that linkage between food and climate as well. And there's a really good book that I'll recommend people read called Civilization Critical. It's by Darren Qualman, published by Fernwood Publishing, a Nova Scotia-based company. And it's he does an excellent job. He looks at oil and carbon and food, and because this was one of the earliest usage with the Industrial Revolution was revolutionizing the way farm work was done and making it far more efficient from a human labor perspective. And he talks about how, in a way, when you think about it, we are stealing time from this ancient source. Oil being this, it's dead ancients, right? In the ground that we've harnessed, and we use their energy to save us time. And our whole civilization, as it is currently, is really built on this time obsession. And to the point where here in Halifax, the mayor ran on and won on the promise to reduce traffic because it's so time consuming, and we have something called rush hour, where when nobody's moving because everyone's in a rush to go to the same place at the same time. And part of that is urban design. We've made some poor decisions historically, which the city has been trying to address lately. And oddly, the mayor seems somewhat against that. But interestingly, it's really all about this time obsession, and we schedule every minute of every day, and it's this very colonial way of doing things, and we're all guilty of it. In the NGO world, my day is very managed by the clock. Every minute is accounted for, and I know where I'm going to be, and we're always in a hurry. Everybody I know is always in a hurry, and it's like it's this cultural phenomenon, and I think it's all very linked to this original thing that to save time and labor, we kind of stole energy from the earth, or harvested energy, however you want to look at it. I guess you don't have to see it as a theft, but we took time from ancient time to save time in the current, and it's all rush. And I think part of the solutions on food is, there's the slow food movement, which is really about sustainability and community building as well, and appreciating food, from the planting and the growth of it and the management of it and the eating of it and the preparing of it, and all those communal elements. And like I said, it's all linked together, and it's localizing, supporting local farmers, as well as local hunters. I think like that's a important aspect too. There is wild meat available, and it can be done in a sustainable way if it's managed properly. That's a particularly like the Mi'kmaq culture was hunting and fishing were big parts of that. So it's kind of, I think we need to give more thought about how things have been done in the past, because we tend to think like, oh, humans are terrible creatures and just destroying. Well, in fact, most humans lived sustainably for a very, very long time. And indigenous cultures were consistently sustainable. Not perfect. No culture or peoples is. I'm not claiming that. I don't want to romanticize, but people lived in a certain way over generation after generation after generation after generation, and it worked. And we've sort of lost our way from that. So we need to think more about how things were done in the past, not necessarily to go back to that. I don't know that that's possible. Kate mentioned that it would probably be very difficult to make Nova Scotia a completely local food system at this point in time. But we need to learn from how things used to be, and do our best to recreate versions of those, modernized version of those.
I think that's the sweet spot.
Industrial
Yeah.
system.
Having run a homestead in the Cape Breton Hills with my partner for 20 plus years, primarily without fossil fuel use up until the last few years, no tractors, doing everything by hand, growing an acre of food and like raising livestock completely by hand.
Amazing.
We certainly learned a lot about old skills and old ways, and we learned what worked now and what can't work now. One of the things that really doesn't work well is that, you know, when people did small farms by hand long ago, everyone did that. Everyone around them was doing the same thing. So there was trade, labor trade, and skill sharing. And, you know, I gave pickles to someone who came and helped me raise my barn. That infrastructure exists less and less. So it's not that that farming model can't work. It can, and it does. It's hyper labor intensive, and it is definitely existing on the fringes of a modernized, economic, mechanized farming system, which is heavily regulated with regulations that don't necessarily make sense for farming in an ecological, small-scale way. However, that way of growing food is so interesting because you, first of all, find yourself in a different time scale. You're not thinking about a season, you're thinking about decades. You're watching your land over many, 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 many years, and pastures changing and developing over many, many years. You're watching generations of cattle that you're keeping together as family groups rather than segregating them and getting rid of the calves when they're, you know, born. It's a whole different time scale to farm in that more ecological way. It requires a lot more people, which means that you bring a lot more people into the work, which makes it a richer experience. You appreciate the food intensely because you know what kind of work went into making it. It is not a romantic lifestyle. It's really freaking hard, but it's also got a lot of meaning and depth and beauty to it. You certainly don't need to buy a gym membership. I mean, there's that. Anyway, yeah, there's a lot to be learned from the past. And I think we can blend traditional knowledge from a variety of cultures with more modern technologies that are also in the service of green, and we'd be in a better place.
I think it's a really rich site of reimagining and reawakening, planting seeds. You know, like this work of like trying to kind of defamiliarize the way that we acquire and appreciate food is, I think, really important. I think all the time about the relationship between food and plastic more than anything. Like, my goodness, right? The kind of normalization of literally everything at the grocery store being encased in plastic, and the policy environment that saw a handful of plastics sort of banned in Canada, but it being delayed because of COVID and this enormous surge in the amount of plastic waste as a result, because suddenly everybody's getting food delivered to their homes in these containers. You know, that they're all kind of bundled together, right? This kind of feeling that I need it now, this kind of obsession with convenience and speed. You know, it has deep historical roots. And Chris, I like that you kind of point to the fact that, like, yeah, those historical roots have now become sort of, they've kind of seeped in to our consciousness, right? Like, and it is about, in some ways, like trying to unlearn this obsession with, speed to some extent, and convenience. But, you know, I'll recommend a book as well. Like Kara Daggett's wonderful book, The Birth of Energy, talks about how it really, this world that we've wrought is largely about trying to kind of put the world to work, right? It's about a certain notion of efficiency that
Hmm.
is about trying to extract every last bit of energy from the world, but also from people, and economically kind of feeding this massive capitalist machine. There's all kinds of value, of course, in the alternative of a kind of low carbon joy. And Daggett ends that book by basically making a plea for a post work imaginary, right?
Hmm.
And the Ecology Action Centre shifted to a 4-day work week, in part, I think, in service of that ethos of a kind of post work, or at least like a less obsessively workaholic world, as in fact a climate solution. And I don't know if we hadn't really planned on talking about this question of like whether to what extent we need to work less in order to address the climate crisis, but it is a relevant thing, right? And I wonder to what extent it's something that would like resonate with people, especially post pandemic, you know?
I can say working in a 4-day work week, it's an excellent way to go. It's we find I think the organization has found that we're as effective as we have always been
Mm.
on a 4-day work week. Um, Hopefully, happier and healthy our staff. I know we can never pay as much as government or private sector. Well, I know from speaking from an energy team perspective, um, you could do energy work in another sector and make a lot more money, but you won't get a 4-day work week. You'll get possibly an 80-hour work week, but I often think of the phrase work-life balance and what it implies, which is that there's your work and then there's your life, which I also think is a flaw, like more fundamentally, because going back to that farm model or the hunter-gatherer systems, work and life weren't balanced or separate. They were just together. I mean, balanced perhaps, but they were integrated. Like it was all together, and you worked with the same people that you played with.
Mhm.
And that's like
And you
that.
probably did multiple jobs, right?
Yeah,
Like
and
there's
and
more
it was
mutability to the
kind
work
of
you
flowed
did.
together naturally. And this idea that like again, it's very time obsessed. You will start your day at 9, you will finish your day at 5, you will log any overtime and take it off later or get paid for it if you're lucky. But it's a really artificial and kind of colonialized notion of how we divvy up our time and how we spend our time and whether we do what matters to us. And the best you can do is love your job. Uh, that's kind of the best case scenario. But we don't have great amount of control over dividing up our time. And so I feel privileged and lucky to work at a organization that has a 4-day work week, but it is still somewhat of a compromise compared to the possible and what has existed in the past.
I think the other piece that I appreciate about our organization is about it's about time, but it's also about the quality of the time we are in work. Sometimes you have a job and you sort of put on your job mask and your job suit and you arrive at work and you inhabit this persona that the corporate world requires you to don in order to be employed. And that doesn't exist, I don't think, in our workplace. I feel as though the Ecology Action Centre has focused so much on centering relationships and trust within the organization that I feel like we show up as whole human beings in our work. And I feel that that translates into the partnerships we have with other organizations and community, and even with when we work with the municipality. There's this sense that this work is difficult, it's emotionally challenging, it's a lot to hold, right? And it's um, even harder to hold if you're holding it with your persona on. If you can show up in this work as a person who's having a tough day and acknowledge I'm having a tough day and have everyone go, cool, glad you're here, rather than pretending that you're something you're not. The work goes so much better. I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about inviting people into a deeper sense of community. Even in our work, we can create that sense of community with each other. We can try to break past some of those capitalist structures that um, get in the way of true climate change work. Um,
Right. Yeah.
actually working in this way with people for their real selves, identifying and acknowledging emotions, working with friction, working with
Mm-hmm.
times when we don't agree, and learning to work skillfully with those things, to my mind, is a form of climate action that's often undervalued and not talked about enough.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
we have to cut emissions. These are the practical things we need to do to solve climate change. We need to cut emissions.
Mm.
But what came before the emissions? It was a set of human behaviors. Where did those human behaviors come from? They came in part because we have not, as a species, been good at dealing with shame, um, sadness, anger, greed, fear,
Mm.
interpersonal discord. When we start working on our relationships and our organizational structures and how we behave together and solve problems together, that's the deep, deep work of climate action.
Yeah. Wow. There's a ton in that I want to unpack. And this is the second time in this conversation that you've invoked this feeling of shame, right? And how detrimental it generally is, right? Like you said earlier, we need to drop the shame in relationship to sort of like, I think the task of building solidarity, like shaming somebody who works in the fossil fuel industry like is probably not going to get them to a place where they feel welcomed into the transition, for example. But also being in a workplace where you feel like ashamed of the feelings of like insecurity or scrambling that you might feel or whatever, like it's going to make you feel deeply uncomfortable and fungible and all of these things that do not contribute to good work. So I think it's like it is part of the ecological revolution that I'm trying to kind of imagine with this series, which is a totally uncertain, unpredictable horizon of possibility that seems to go. Here's the question, I guess, is like, does that go through shame or does it have to go around it, right? Like, there's this phrase, right? Like, the only way out is through. And there is a lot of shame. I mean, like, when I go to pump gas into my car, I feel a kind of like physical, like gross, like I feel a sort of shame, like I'm still doing this. I think that toxic convenience of fossil fuel abuse does inspire a level of shame, but I'm not always sure whether it is responsibility that is at stake in that feeling of shame, or
Mm,
if it's just about like the shame actually isolating me more on some level. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
it doesn't seem to be a mobilizing emotion, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I mean, I think we saw, if you kind of look back at the history of movements trying to motivate people to take climate action, what I've observed is that maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, what you saw was organizations saying, here are the top 10 things you should do to reduce your emissions, and you should do these things. And then you look at those top 10 things, and they were things like become a vegan and, never fly in an airplane again or put solar panels on your roof, and all good ideas, but completely out of reach for an awful lot of people. The actions that were promoted heavily as if they were the only thing you could do were really privileged. And it really alienated, I think, an awful lot of people of goodwill who wanted to contribute and wanted to do their part, but lacked the resources, the time, the capacity, the whatever to do those specific things. And I think we've wasted an awful lot of time beating each other up about not being able to do the best thing. We're all at different places. We're all at different stages. We all have different capacities. People are coming at all of these questions from very different backgrounds and conditions. And I think we need to stop wasting time yelling at each other for not doing everything right and start lifting each other up for every contribution that can be made.
I think that's great. And I mean, like, the idea here for me is like, how do you make it every day and achievable? And how do you like bring people into the
Mhm.
fold? The best climate politics is clearly that kind of a generous, more inviting one.
Mm.
And like kinder, like literally like trying to embody a kind of kindness in response to the unbelievable pressures that people currently feel, you know? And so I mean, like, I think we still do need to be able to like have these conversations about a future after oil and all of these like you know, toxic vested interests that are in the way, that do stand in the way of the transition, and press for regulation to constrain the power of fossil capital. That's all true. But then there's also this like grassroots element that I feel like usually way more inspired by when I'm participating in it here, right?
Mhm.
When you like, you know, just go to a place like Hope Blooms, or you talk to folks from the Ecology Action Center, or Everyone Every Day, or wherever, these local organizations that are trying to not just conceptualize an off ramp, but actually give people things to do, to move into a different mindset. I think like that's the good stuff.
Mhm.
But you know, I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a thought experiment on this point. I created a short series of podcast episodes with a collective called After Oil. We called the podcast Volatile Trajectories, because we are on a volatile trajectory. But the first episode was maybe my favorite. It features a set of folks, Hiroki Shin and Graham McDonald and Tara Schwerin Rowe, talking about this like museum of the future, right? So if we do it, if we actually manage to you know, undergo the massive infrastructural transition that will be required, there's going to be a lot of relics of this time that will look kind of like incomprehensible to us. And there's a lovely French animated film actually that came out, I think, last year called Arco, where this kid from the future who travels back in time sees a lot of these like weird artifacts of our age and kind of doesn't know what to make of them.
Mm.
In this episode, like they each kind of give an item that they would like to put in that museum of the future. And I asked you to kind of think on what you might like to place in this, you know, this hypothetical museum of our current, like, petroleum obsessed time. And it's a personal decision. Like in this episode, I think Tara put a lawnmower in the museum, which I loved. Gas powered lawnmowers are so like everyday and yet such an odd thing to just be using routinely.
Whatever
Um,
they're powered by, they're ridiculous.
they're ridiculous. They're poisoning our neighborhoods, and we kind of don't clock it as being a thing. For myself, I think I would just put like a bottle of water. Like there has to be a moment in the future where that will seem so incredibly alien to even our species. The notion of a bit of water contained in a plastic water bottle.
Mm.
Anyway, um, so and maybe something fancy like Evian or Fiji or something like that has all the packaging and branding. Like it really is like this fetish object. What would you throw into that museum as like a, you know, a site of like reflection, or like something that give pause to folks in the future about our current pretty bonkers time of fossil fuel abuse? Who would
I
like to
had a
go
couple of
first?
thoughts about that,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think the first thing that sprang to mind for me was the gas-powered leaf blower.
Sure.
Um, it feels like such a an extravagance to borrow this ancient carbon source that is going to seem so precious and rare to people
Mm-hmm.
thousands of years from now, to
Mm.
mindlessly blow a few leaves around a yard. I love raking. Like, it builds my
Nothing
biceps.
wrong
It
with it.
feels good. It's quiet.
Mm-hmm.
But, to spend fossil fuel on flinging leaves around, I don't get that. Never have gotten that.
I have so much to say about this. I forget which actor it is that's constantly ranting about leaf blowers. It might be Kate Blanchett. She's always talking about leaf blowers and how ridiculous they are. There's no question, right? Loud, smelly, Sisyphean. I mean, you're just going to get the leaves blown around. Also, leave the leaves where they are. They're
Right.
terrific
Exactly.
nest for
Exactly.
pollinators.
Leave the
Let
leaves
them be.
alone. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great choice. What about you, Chris?
I got two, and a very small one and a very large one. So the small one kind of is reminiscent of your water bottle, but the styrofoam cup for the same
Oh,
reason, just
yeah.
for a one-time use. This precious resource, as Kate said, that is ancient and limited, finite resource, and you use it to make a thing that carries a beverage for 5 minutes, and then you chuck it away, and it goes to the landfill.
Wild.
And somewhat related, but writ large, is my museum object would be the plastic island in the ocean. That
Oh,
massive plastic island that just keeps growing and growing because it all accumulates together, and people don't know how to solve that problem. But
mm.
uh, yeah, just
Yeah.
put that in the museum.
The
I had a
garbage patch,
second
yeah.
one too, Scott, that just like it's kind of a weird one because in a way we think of it as a green solution, but it's like the reusable shopping bags that got
Mm.
manufactured that we all now own 400 million of because we can't remember to bring them into the grocery store because it's just like it sort of symbolizes for me this tendency we have to address a systemic problem through mass production of yet another consumer object
Mm-hmm.
while placing responsibility on individuals,
Mm.
right? What was that bag manufactured to deal with? It was meant to deal with plastic, but it also doesn't address the sort of massive amounts of consumer spending we all tend to do. We
Mm-hmm.
probably wouldn't need all of these bags if we weren't out buying crap we didn't need all the time.
That's it.
So, and now we've
That's
just
it.
sort of generated another big pile of things.
Polyester bags, which I think it's a great choice because these bags are often emblazoned with all of this cognitive dissonance inducing environmental messaging that says you are making the greener, more sustainable, more local, all these things that
Mhm.
are value captured words that you also see on the sides of, like, Irving tankers bringing fuel oil to your home, right? They're selling you your values back to you as well. But it's like the gas you were talking about, Chris, where like the invisibility of the effects is what allows it to kind of capture those values. Like if it was the case that we had more of, I think, like a radar or attunement to the actual nature of these materials, then that I have to think would spark something uncomfortable, alienating, but productively so in human beings. Like the styrofoam cup should feel incredibly like alien. It should feel absurd to use it in the way that we do. And it doesn't, because I think of that like lack of attunement to just like materiality, almost the supply chain, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But
It's like
telling the story of that
old
is
ad
the
where
story of stuff is tricky. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry, is that like that old ad or PSA where the dad's fishing with his son on the boat and he throws his beer can in the ocean and the son says, "Where's it go?" And he says, "Away."
Okay.
That's it.
For that.
It's a way. Yeah, I mean, the petrochemical side of it, the plastic side of it, I could say a whole lot more about, but I've done other episodes on that, so I won't. Um, the place where I think we maybe can end, and we'll be circling back in a way to the beginning, which is around this question of allowing it to be true that we are in the rapids, as Bill McKibben has put it. Like, we are in the rapids now. We are not coming up on the rapids. We're in this state of uncertainty, of unpredictability. And I think we need to adapt our messaging to reflect that in some ways. Like, I'm invested in the experiments that communicators are doing around like surrealism and trying to reflect climate weirding in weird ways and all that kind of stuff. What I am less inclined to accept, I guess, or to champion is the language of "it's too late," which I find deeply distressing. Like, it's not about just moral responsibility, because I wouldn't just assign that to someone like David Suzuki or whoever. But there are folks like Suzuki is like one of the best known environmentalists in Canada. And he's recently been sort of doing the rounds and speaking quite like flippantly about Elon Musk, and that's great. But saying that in some ways it is, and we have to accept the fact that it is too late to avert the worst effects, and that we're reaching these tipping points. There are few things that are like more demobilizing or like paralyzing than hearing this talk of like the Atlantic current failing, or massive food systems collapse. Like, it really does inspire a level of immobilizing dread, I think, in folks. But at the same time, like, there's no question that what we sometimes call the social cost of carbon is going to be very, very high, and that we need to prepare for that future. Where do you land in terms of that specific messaging from prominent figures like Suzuki, but also like many, many others that say it's kind of too late now? Like, what do we even say in response to that sort of language? And is it, from your perspective, kind of irresponsible to use that language?
I don't know that it's irresponsible. I think it may be imprecise. It's like too late for what exactly? It may be too late to avoid certain kinds of um, damage or consequences. It may be too late, for example, to preserve certain kinds of species or places as we have known them. But I don't think there is any point at which it is too late to continue to try to prevent additional degrees of warming from happening. There's no point at which adaptation stops mattering. So, again, I think I go back to that point of we trying to parse all of the data that's out there is extremely challenging. There's a range of scientific opinion about where all of this is heading. Even within on the lower end of the range, it's not great news. So, I think I find myself looking squarely at the reality of things are going to get tough in a lot of ways for a lot of people and a lot of species in the near future and into the future. We still, each of us who is born, has one life. We have joy in that life. We have love in that life. We have collectivity. We have creativity. We have options to step forward and attempt to assist other people and other non-human species to live the best lives that they can under the circumstances. So I don't ever feel like it's going to be too late. I will say that one of the books that really helped me grapple with all of this has probably the most depressing title and cover art of any book I've ever read on climate change. It's called Learning to Die: Wisdom in the Age of Climate Crisis. I used to work at a bookstore, and I think I've sold personally over 80 copies of this book. It's by Robert Bringhurst and Jan Zwicky, a poet and a philosopher. And they bypass all of the scientific debate, all of the technological everything, and they go right to the heart of the existential crisis that we're all trying to not look at, which is dying. Our own personal deaths, the end of the things that we love, the end of this planet, the end of all of that. It sounds depressing as hell, and I promise you it's not. It's actually a very beautiful, clear-eyed meditation on what it means to live, what it means to accept the challenge of being alive in the world and the joy and the beauty of that. And it really calls us to look at something we North Americans anyway don't tend to want to look at, which is our own mortality. And when you can learn to sort of sit still with the reality that climate change or no climate change, I am actually going to die someday. You know, when you really begin to realize our time on Earth is always limited, no matter what is going on. There's a switch that can happen where you sort of say, right, there are forces beyond my control. There are things that I can control. What do I have? What are my gifts? What are my talents? What is my time? Who are my people? How can I help? How can I plug in? How can I suck every bit of joy and delight out of this experience of being alive? And how can I bring as much of that as possible to those around me before my candle goes out?
Beautiful. Yeah. That's a tough act to follow, Chris. I have my own thoughts on that particular articulation of, accepting mortality as almost like a condition for courage. But I'll let you chime in here. Like, what is it for you that kind of keeps you going, and how do you respond to this claim that it's too late, so to speak?
Um, I think that or certainly in Suzuki's case, I think that comes also from a place of grief. I mean, talking about a scientist who has lived an extraordinary life but has made the case on climate and other environmental issues for many, many decades, and is very frustrated by the lack of progress. And as Kate said, yeah, it's like I believe he's written about this and he's gotten more into depth, and he's been clear that it's too late to prevent certain things. And that doesn't necessarily mean we should stop trying to decarbonize. It definitely does not mean that. We need to continue those efforts. And I think we need to continue the efforts to figure out new ways to live. The author, Daniel Quinn, who wrote a really interesting book, Ishmael, said if humans are still around in 200 years, they will not be living anything like we live now. And I think that's an absolute fact. If we keep living like this, it's over. But if we find new ways to live, and that means new ways to build community and to be together and to work and play together, and take care of each other, then there's hope. Yeah, maybe we have to move inland. There will be adaptation involved as well. But adaptation doesn't mean you stop doing the mitigation. You don't stop decarbonizing just because you also move inland. And I'll revisit my own writing when my partner was pregnant with our first child, and I was writing about the decision to have children. And I asked some of the smartest people I know about it. I was like, what do you think about the fact that I'm reproducing, that I'm bringing a child into this world? And I got all kinds of different answers. It was really interesting, but one that really sticks with me was my friend Mark Merritt, who lives in New York City. And he said, if you want to have children and you don't have children, you're giving up. You're basically saying life is not worth recreating anymore. And if you want to have children and you can, you should, because that's your hope that they'll have and they may be part of the solution that we seek. Who knows? You have no idea. But to stop reproducing is to give up on existence. And I don't want to give that. And as Kate said, we're all going to die. We just got to figure out how to live our best lives, not only individually. I think there's a really good industry around doing it individually, a whole self-help industry and all this. We need to figure out how to do it together And that's the part that's missing for the self-help movement for the most part. Figure out not only how to live our individual best lives, but how to live our community-based best lives, our best lives together, taking care of each other and doing our best for each other. And yeah, it's never too late to do that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you've got me both. You both got me thinking about this book by James Rowe that I discussed with him a while back on basically like reclaiming mindfulness from this kind of individualistic industrialization almost of this idea, selling it as a source of self-help. Self-help. He says that it, in large part, for him, comes down to overcoming a kind of resistance to the fact of our own demise. And
Mhm.
he makes the claim, like politically speaking, that resistance is something that creates the conditions for oppression across the board. I mean, like the kind of ways in which the nation itself is seen as like this immortal entity, or the corporation even as a thing that can never end. It's like somehow inherently oppressive. So, reckoning with the finite nature of our, as Mary Oliver says, like wild precious life, can be, a condition of possibility for like a different feeling of responsibility to the coming generation, your kids, right? Reclimate has research that shows one of the biggest predictors of whether people become concerned with climate change and start to act is having kids across the political spectrum, right or
Hmm.
left. Having kids tends to be a thing that changes your mind around that feeling of responsibility. So, anyway, unbelievable amounts of just like questions still brimming for me, but I think we're going to have to leave it here. I just want to thank you both so much for making the time. It's been a real treat talking to you.
It's
Thanks
a
so
great
much for
pleasure.
having us.
Thank you.
Mm.